Go. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first session of our Moms at Work Summer Summit. And here with me today is Kadie Ward, our Pay Equity Commissioner for Ontario. But first, I wanted to really quickly run through some housekeeping rules before we get started. This meeting is going to be recorded and posted to our Moms at Work YouTube channel, so you can feel free to keep your camera off. The best viewing experience, I recommend selecting the speaker view in the top right-hand corner. And we ask that you keep yourself on mute. We are going to be taking questions during the final 15 minutes. And if you can submit your questions via the chat window, we're going to do our best to get to as many as possible. For those of you who are just joining us, welcome. To everyone who donated or purchased a shirt or mug from our Moms at Work store, thank you. We are committed to keeping these events free and accessible, so any donations are appreciated. They help us cover the cost and coordination for these events. So today's event is the first of 11 events we have planned over the summer in our lead up to our fall campaigns. And with that, I would like to introduce you to our wonderful speaker, who I just already mentioned. Kadie Ward is the Commissioner and Chief Administrative Officer of the Pay Equity Commission of Ontario, a position she's held since 2020. Her career has been characterized by successful collaboration across public, private, and civil society organizations, designing and delivering inclusive economic growth strategies that engage traditionally marginalized populations. Her experience has taken her around the world to establish programs and legislation to support women's participation in the economy. And most recently, she's worked with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to implement aspects of the federal government's feminist international assistance policy, focusing on increasing women's participation in the labor market. Commissioner Ward holds an MA from Western and an MBA from Schulich School of Business. So on that note, anything else you wanted to add, Kadie?
No, that's good. I'll talk a bit about my experience. Questions. Yeah.
Get right to the questions.
Yes.
Great. So just so everybody knows, we will have, if you want to pop in, if you think of something, you can ask them in the chat just so that you don't forget, or if you're watching Paw Patrol in the side. But we're going to try and do a pretty big overview of pay equity in general and what the Pay Equity Commissioner does. So let's start with that. What exactly, what does the Ontario Pay Equity Commissioner do? And what is your office responsible for, is my first question. And to add to that, how does one become a Pay Equity Commissioner? Because I think that's always been my biggest question.
That's a lot to answer. So before I tell you, what the commissioner does, I'll hit that second part of your question, which was what are we responsible for? Right. So I'll tell you a little bit about the commission.
Okay.
The Pay Equity Commission is an agency of the Ministry of Labour Training and Skills Development, so your audience knows where we're situated. And my role as Commissioner and Chief Administrative Officer, I'm the administrative head of the entire commission. I think it's important to note that the commission is actually divided into two very separate and distinct bodies, and that's really important for what we do and for how we serve our constituents, well, women and companies across Ontario. So we have the Pay Equity Office and the Pay Equity Hearings Tribunal. So the office supports sort of the day-to-day compliance with the Pay Equity Act, and we do that by helping employers actually understand what their responsibilities are under the Act, and also supporting employees or individuals who feel that there's been a contravention of the Act. We also undertake a significant amount of education and outreach in partnership with activities like this that really provide education on economic justice for women. Another important part of our work is that we investigate complaints. So employees, both men and women actually, can bring a complaint to us alleging a contravention of the Pay Equity Act. And so we have a team of review officers who are independent, who do investigations, and they work to try to resolve a complaint by encouraging the parties to come together, reach a settlement, or they issue an order that's enforceable by the Pay Equity Act where there can't be a settlement. So this is where the second part of our office comes in, which is the Pay Equity Hearings Tribunal. So this is an arm's length adjudicative body that hears and decides on appeals made in response to actually the decisions that the Pay Equity Office makes. So if an employer and employee disagrees with the decision that the Pay Equity Office made, they go to a separate and distinct body to appeal that decision, And then the Pay Equity Hearings Tribunal, has exclusive jurisdiction to listen, to determine facts, and to make a decision that's concrete before it. So I think it's important for folks to understand, especially if they might want to contact us for a complaint, to understand that that's the process as it comes to the office, and then if need be through the tribunal. In terms of how to become a pay equity commissioner, well, I think there's different paths for everyone. For me, my career started in economic development, and workforce and labor relation issues is sort of one pillar of a community and nation's economic development strategy. So it's something I threaded throughout my career, but about 8 years ago, I started working on internationally in transition and developing economies. And it's there that I really got involved in women's economic empowerment and supporting women entering workforce and being, paid participants in the community's labor market. And, the most interesting part for me was developing and delivering programs, as you mentioned in my bio, under the federal government's feminist international assistance policy, where I really had a pronounced mandate to focus on gender equality. And I was living abroad for several years, but in 2019, I decided to come home because I had this sort of aha moment where I realized I was helping all these cities and nations around the world make strides towards equity, but then I would come home to visit and I would notice that there was still a lot of work to do at home. So I resigned from that job. I started my MBA. And while completing my MBA, I filled out a profile on the Ontario Public Appointments Secretariat. So for your members who don't know, this is an open site for anyone in Ontario to make a profile and then indicate interest in volunteering for or working for one of Ontario's 170 agencies or 360 boards and committees. So encourage folks to just Google Ontario Public Appointments Secretariat because there's opportunities if you're interested. So I created the profile, and then I really kept an active eye on openings related to things I was interested in and things I had worked in, which was economic development, education, women, equity. And then the commissioner ad was posted, and I didn't hesitate for a second. I submitted an application, made it through a round of interviews, and then was appointed in August 2020. So it's quite the journey.
Yeah, that was not what I was expecting, but that. So for everybody who's out there, it's like you can apply out there, and sometimes they do post jobs like the Pay Equity Commission. Hopefully not for a while because Katie's there right now, and that is where we would like her to stay for now. All right, perfect. So that's a good overview. I think the next thing is we, especially in Moms at Work, we hear a lot about the gender wage gap. And what I kind of want to tone down is what exactly is it, or how is it measured? And what does that situation look like in Canada?
Sure. So the gender wage gap is really the difference between wages earned by men and wages earned by women. Okay. We'll get into the complexities of that second part of this answer, but the gap can be measured in various ways, and how you, like any statistic, the criteria you set is going to influence what the number is. So the most common measure is to look at full-time, full-year wages. Okay. Now, we know that not all people in the labor market work full-time, full-year wages. So you can also look at the measure of the gender wage gap based on hourly wages, and then you can break that down: hourly wages for full-time, hourly wages part-time. We're now at a point where we're understanding we need to further break that data down intersectionally to see how the gap impacts different gender identities and racialized persons, because we've seen a lot about this in the media, and we know that it's different for different segments of the population. So, as I said, the way you calculate it is going to produce a different result. Stats Canada, the most recent stat they've put out in 2018, show that the gender wage gap in Ontario is about 12.2%, but this is the full-time and part-time workers in core working age group of 25 to 54. So that's just part of the context for the listeners and viewers to understand, which measure that is. So for Ontario, that means that, for every dollar a man earns, a female worker will earn 88 cents. The current situation in Canada, since 1997, we've been tracking, and we know that every single province has decreased the gender wage gap by 6 to 13%. Alison, we can provide the data for you on each province's gender gap because it's different by province. As I said, as of 2018, Ontario's gap was 12.2 and Canada's 13.3. Newfoundland and Labrador have the lowest gap at 8.4, but I can get my team to follow up.
Yes.
So you can share that with your members, how it differs across the country.
Okay. That's great. Yeah. We love statistics at Moms at Work. We're very much interested in information.
Yeah.
So here's the bigger question.
Yeah.
It's 2021.
Yeah.
Why do we still have a wage gap?
That is a good question. And when I was thinking about that, because, we talked about the questions in advance, I realized, it took 20 years or 21 years from, 1997 to 2018 for the gender wage gap to close by just over 5% in Ontario. And I was thinking about this, that, if we understand why it's actually closing, I think we can gain better insight on why we still have it. Right. So I'll talk about, why it's closing and then some assumptions on why it still exists. So, Statistics Canada noted that reduction was largely explained by changes in the distribution of men and women across occupations. So women are less pigeonholed into jobs labeled as, women's work. I really dislike those labels, but, that's the reality, is that women are stepping out of these women's work jobs and they're leveled across different occupations. Also, women's increase in educational attainment is becoming part of the reason why the gap is closing. And then in some parts, this is not great, but in some part the gap is narrowing because men's wages are actually decreasing with the decline, say, of the manufacturing sector and the share of men in unionized employment. So there is that relationship. Okay, so we know it's closing. Second part, like, why do we still have it? Why does it persist? Well, there's, Stats Canada and other researchers talk about some assumptions about the persistence. So I'll share those with you. One, you and your community are intimately familiar with this, is that women choose, brackets, or need to leave and re-enter the workforce in order to meet family caregiving responsibilities. And you talk a lot about this and you support women with this, but as we know, this can result in a loss of seniority, advancement opportunities, and ultimately wages, right? The gap starts. Women are more likely to work part-time due to these care responsibilities, which again starts to create and widen that gap. This is a big problem too. Women continue to be clustered in historically undervalued or low-paying jobs. Like, unfortunately, childcare, clerical work, some of these jobs where it's female-dominated tend to be valued less, even though they involve the same or greater skills, right? And this is also related to barriers women face when trying to enter, and air quotes again, non-traditional sectors like skilled trades or mining, where wages are quite higher. Women were historically, as I said, considered to have less education attainment, but that's becoming less and less of a factor as more women are graduating. So, we know that that's actually a reason why the gap is closing, but also part of the persistence. So 2/3 of the gap remains unexplained, and unobservable wage-related characteristics. Some of the discussion has been around things like gender difference in behaviors. So we know that men tend to negotiate salaries more than women, and you've talked about this. Or women aren't as assertive, but like, we're socialized not to. So it's like this double-edged sword, right? Or societal expectations, some constrained choices, like women might not have the same choices because of other situations around them. And then, of course, the impact of explicit or implicit just gender-based discrimination. So, we haven't been able to determine all of those, that 2/3. And this is largely because we still need to develop research methodologies to measure like really subtle, but like massive things like unconscious bias in hiring, promotion, and compensation practices.
Yep. So, like, simple answer, right?
Yeah, exactly. Not so complex. It's like, the best part about COVID is that it's not the best. There's a lot of awful things, but it has brought this to the light. Like, yes. We are now looking and diving for intersectional data and trying to understand unconscious bias, because we see that it has real economic impact for women.
It does. Yeah, right. So I think people are going to have to watch that a couple times over, but that's part of the work that we do in Moms at Work, is try to break down some of those barriers and say that this is a multi-pronged issue, that you can't just say, we're going to fix this by doing X, or we're going to fix this by doing Y.
Exactly.
So as we're talking about COVID, many women have been involuntarily, I use that term, I was like, there was not much choice there, displaced from the labor market during COVID. So how much of Canada's economic recovery depends on women recapturing these gains?
Yeah, well, I'll start by quoting Canadian economist Armin Yelnatsan, who said, "There's no recovery without a she-covery." And second, I want to, Alison, acknowledge all the women who are members of Moms at Work who have been displaced. There's a lot of conversation about this in your group, and I'm so sorry you're experiencing this, and you're not alone, and you have a resource here to support it. But until recently, women's participation in the labor market in Ontario increased dramatically. From 1976 to 2019, the participation gap between men and women in Ontario narrowed from 39 to 9 percentage points. So that's massive. Yeah, so fueling this, was a growing recognition that women's representation in the labor market has both social and economic benefits, not just driving, gender equality, sort of, the moral or cultural social imperative, but there was a huge economic imperative. It grew household income and workforce productivity. So, Canada's recovery and Ontario's recovery is absolutely linked to women recapturing lost gains in the labor market. And, there's a strong moral argument, but there's really an economic one. And I think this is the one that the policymakers look at this, right? How are we going to recover the economy? Well, McKinsey Consulting estimates that by 2026, Canada could add $150 billion to its annual GDP by supporting women's equitable participation in the workforce. So RBC puts that number at 100 billion, but regardless, 100 or 150 billion, we're splitting hairs. So we cannot recover from this recession without women's equitable participation in the labor market. And I'll just add one kind of broad economic indicator, but the reality is too, if women don't return to work, household income and household spending doesn't recover. And this is really concerning for a country like Canada, given that 57% of GDP is driven by household spending. So it's connected to a much larger conversation about economics and economic recovery.
Right. Let's think. And we're going to reiterate to our members, I'm like, you matter. Your spending matters, your participation matters, your voice matters. Like it's all the pieces that make that up. And I think that there's a very big disconnect in the fact that it's just job related. I'm like, that has knock-on effects for taxes and spending and all the other things. And that, there were a lot of dual income households that, increase spending. And so these are great. This is great information for people to understand, why it is so important for Canada to really invest in this recovery.
Absolutely.
So, here's the other thing that, and we've talked about this before, a frustration of mine when talking with employers is that I want people to understand what the difference is between equal pay for equal work and equal pay for work of equal value, and why it matters, because it is a difference, right?
It is. Thank you for asking the question, because there is a lot of confusion around these concepts. So our office, the Pay Equity Office, focuses specifically on pay equity. And as you said, that's equal pay for work of equal value. Right. And so equal pay for equal work is very different. It means that men and women doing the exact same job should be paid the same. So, a man and woman on a line moving widgets get paid the same. A man and woman, both genders, get paid the same. Equal pay for work of equal pay for equal work is covered in Employment Standard Act. That's outside of pay equity. Pay equity for us focuses on the equal value part, which is sort of like relational. And so what it does is it demonstrates that compensation within an organization should be evaluated, first of all, in a gender neutral way that provides, and this is the important part, compensation based on the value the job provides to the organization versus the gender person doing the job. So what we have seen is that, work that's been stereotyped again as women's work has been historically devalued, right? So we say, well, because it's being delivered by a woman, it's of less value, or, it's not innovative, it's not whatever. But to fix this, pay equity looks at, okay, how, and if a job classification within an organization, how does it contribute equally to an organization's success? So of equal value. And if they provide equal value, they should be paid the same. So you can compare very different jobs and say that, they're completely different job descriptions, but when you look at our act, it actually sets out the foundations for a gender neutral comparison which involves a lot of processes I won't get into, but you quantify the job basically. And you look at the same 4 gender neutral factors of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. And jobs that end up with similar scores should be paid the same or very similar, right? Like you map them out. And so that score is a number, not a gender. And that's very, very important. So, I'm going to use some stereotypical examples because that's what we have to work with here. But how can a company say that a janitor, which is a stereotypical male job, at least 20, 30 years ago, provides more value than a secretary, which is a stereotypical female job, and then pay them differently? Well, they can't, because if we've done cases similar to this, where if you look at the factor of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions, and we have different methodologies, I won't get into them, but one's job-to-job comparison, proportional value, we can actually quantify the value of a job class, and then we can compare them and then determine if there's systemic devaluation of a job because it's held by women. And if there is, we mandate that those wages be adjusted. And so, you ask, why does this matter? Well, it matters because what we've seen is through that quantification process, like plotting all of these different jobs and coming up with the point systems and then comparing, it's been a really eye-opening process for employers we've worked with that makes them realize unconscious assumptions that they've held about the value of various roles within a company. So that's what measuring work of equal value actually means.
And so that's that. So, and that's for anybody who's interested, that information is also on your website as well, the process, because it is a very specific classification and they have very specific methodology for reviewing jobs, and companies should be reviewing these jobs, right? Proactively. That would be the goal, is to be proactively doing that before you end up in the tribunal at the commissioner's office, right?
Exactly.
So it's a little bit thing, but they also have great, we're going to put up a slide at the end of this before we go to questions with how to get onto that webpage and look at the resources that exist there.
Sure.
So for those of us, this is going to get personal now. For those of us wanting to see change within our organizations, can you give us a business case for pay equity in the workplace?
Absolutely. I'm going to start by saying that the business case for pay equity is rooted in a larger case for diversity, equity, inclusion in the workforce broadly, because I think that's part where it starts, right? The main argument is this, like inclusion, we know already, and there's so much data that supports this. It's fundamental to an organization's ability to continuously innovate and adapt to a volatile market like where we're at right now. And, you could say to your boss or your manager, especially if it's public sector or private sector, a business's responsibility to society and shareholders is to create value through innovation, or at least facilitate value creation by, ensuring space for that. And this necessitates and recognizes that, discriminating against ideas and innovations or not compensating them fairly because they're delivered by a woman is actually really detrimental to innovation and value creation. Like that points to the heart of most businesses, right? And this is also backed by research. Harvard Business Review talks about how organizations are motivated to achieve pay equity out of fear because they're afraid of litigation, or out of a moral imperative because it's the right thing to do. And those are great arguments, and both are totally valid. But we often talk about the third imperative, which is the economic one. And companies need pay equity, they need inclusion to gain a competitive advantage. Like if that's where your manager's mindset is, then go with that argument. McKinsey & Company Global Institute report found that narrowing the gender wage gap could add between 12 and 28 trillion to the global GDP. And so private sector employers see this as a cost to their bottom line, right? Oh my God, we're going to pay more, and then they resist it. But what they don't see is actually the cost of inequitable compensation and the cost of having lack of gender equality to their innovation and productivity. Because there's research, McKinsey, I love to cite their reports. They're doing excellent work, documenting the impact of excluding and excluding women. And they looked at 1,000 organizations across 15 countries. And they noted that like diverse, inclusive teams with high gender diversity and equity were more likely to radically innovate and help their companies gain a competitive edge. And, companies with gender diversity and inclusion on executive teams were 25% more likely to experience above average profitability than peer companies without it. So there is a strong business case to be made to the managers to say, like, this creates an environment, and pay equity and paying employees actively and being inclusive in that way is really an effective way to build high performing culture and drive employee engagement, enthusiasm, all of those things that drive innovation and an organization's competitiveness. It's also the law, but we'll get into that.
It's also illegal. No, but I think that
sometimes,
sometimes that's not the best argument to go in with, although it should be. So that's asked all the time by our members. It's like, how do I push this forward? How do I do these things? And there is a strong business case, and McKinsey, all of their reports are available publicly. If anybody's interested in going to read the data, they're big ones, some of them, but totally worth spending your Wednesday evening, just digging into that, right? That's what I do.
We can share some links to the reports that we particularly like.
Yep, perfect. So that sounds great. So how do we get there? Is it up to individual businesses? And sort of what is currently legislated and what needs to be legislated? Because I think those are the two different things. Some things are there and some things are not.
Right. Well, as I said, ending my last question, pay equity is already the law in Ontario and Quebec. In fact, Ontario was the first government globally to pass a Pay Equity Act. The Federal Pay Equity Act has passed third reading and will apply to federally regulated employers.
Right.
Manitoba, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI have pay equity legislation, but just for the public sector, it doesn't cover the private sector. While Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia have no specific legislation on pay equity, but they address pay equity pay discrimination through human rights legislation. So, beyond legislation and regulation, you're asking, like, how else do we get there? For our part, the Pay Equity Office is really prioritizing education and outreach with allies and respective partners in this work, like working with your group and other, even employer membership-based groups.
Yep.
Because I think we all have a role in keeping this conversation going. So policymakers at both the federal and provincial levels continue enforcing and creating legislation or programs that address, women's economic justice and support closing the gender wage gap. So for your viewers, I know you're national. If your province doesn't have a specific policy tool or program to address the gender wage gap, gather your colleagues, consult, talk about and propose solutions. If your province does have some kind of policy or program addressing pay equity, learn how you can promote it and just elevate the fact that it's available for people, individuals and businesses to leverage. I'll close this part of the question by just noting that our collective responsibility to educate young girls in our lives, first of all, to pursue jobs they are interested in, not prescribed to them, and to prepare them to negotiate and ask for more, and to continue to lead public discourse on just the economic injustice of wage inequity in general.
Yes. And I think I'm like, that has to be like the focus that all of this learning that we do here, I have all of these discussions with my boys, and, I have 3 boys, and we discuss these things, much to some eye rolling in that, but it's important that they understand, because systems are not usually talked about, when they're younger. And it's especially important as, kids are going for their first jobs and, understanding what pay means and how things are calculated. And it's education. And you're right, it's education.
I'll just add to this before we jump to the next question. Girl Guides Canada did an amazing report and noted that the wage gap actually starts at like 11, 12, 13, when students go get those first jobs, because young girls will maybe babysit and it's informal economy and they get paid a lot less than, say, the young boys who will cut lawn or take on, other jobs. So really starting to educate very young, if a young woman is, I babysat, it was great, I loved it, but, got paid next to nothing. So educating and saying, like, no, your time is worth something, and having those conversations at a very young age. Yes.
Perfect. So on an individual level, I am constantly referring people there. What can our members do if they do have a pay equity concern, and who do they talk to? What does that look like, that process?
Yeah, the process is really accessible actually for anyone who has a pay equity concern about something that's happening in their specific workplace or specific circumstances. First, I would say, as a first point, go to our website, payequity.gov.on.ca. I'm sure that's on your closing slide. And there's a lot of information just available there on the process. You can certainly submit an anonymous inquiry by email or phone. And then if you've read about the contraventions and what that means, you can actually make a formal application for review services, and we'll follow up. So I just want to note, because I think this is an important thing to say to your members and anybody wanting to put in a complaint or talk to us, is that the Pay Equity Act actually protects employees from reprisal for asking their employer questions about pay equity and filing an application with us. So, it protects from sort of wrongful dismissal related to asking about pay equity. So there is that provision, because we see it often, women don't want to speak up because they're afraid of the outcomes. But here the Act protects employees in asking these questions.
Great. So those were all of my questions, and wow, we are like right on time. That is impressive. Colette has the slides to show all the information that we can put up, and then we're going to open up the chat.
And I just noticed my excellent team member. Team member Olena has been putting in the chat the reports I referred to, so your community can take a look at those.
Yes, perfect. And we're going to share those. We'll share those links after to when we send out the recording. We'll put all the links, because she also shared the statistics for the wage gap for all of the. Oh yeah.
So good.
So good. There's it. So
amazing.
That is.
Thank you, Elena.
This is the slide, the email, also on Twitter, and the website with all the information is right there. So we will have that when you watch the recording afterwards. You can take this information away, and we will also send it out in the email that has the recording in it for you if you weren't able to watch the whole thing. And now we have about 15 minutes for questions. So we left lots of time for questions, because I know a lot of these things don't often give interaction to the speakers, and that's what people wanted. So we're leaving some time for it. Let me see. Perfect. Oops.
No, I'm here. I'm good.
Okay. Yep. Good.
All good. I just stopped the share. Okay, so I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but I have one I can start things off with. So I guess you were talking about, how awareness about gender pay gap and everything needs to kind of start early with women and just with everyone in general. Is there anything for teachers, or do you know of any, like, are teachers in high school or co-op programs, are they talking about this? Is it in the curriculum, or is it kind of left up to the individual teachers to kind of do the research and bring it in on their own?
Yeah, that is a great question. I know, prior to my engagement with the Pay Equity Commission, there had been submissions from the Pay Equity Office to the Ministry of Education and other spaces to talk about curriculum development. It's fantastic that you've asked that, because this is something that my team has talked about, to say, how do we make submissions to the other ministries within the government to take a look at and talk about curriculum development. We're in conversations with other agencies like TBO, who is creating a significant number of online courses for high school and junior students. I know many of you are, your own moms. Hopefully you've been seeing the content TBO made. We've had casual conversations with them saying, hey, would you be interested in a curriculum that looks like this? We have made some outreach to colleges and universities as well to teach, to start this conversation with students taking HR related courses. The bigger challenge with colleges and universities is that curriculum is not regulated. So we're working kind of one professor or one diploma or degree program at a time. But still, that's still one degree program, one diploma program at a time. So we have a couple of relationships with universities where we do guest lectures and we provide material on this. So I think the broader conversation about pay equity and gender equity is coming for elementary and high school curriculum, and it's certainly on our radar for something that we can be creating and sharing content for that, because it's crucial. I mean, the curriculum sets a standard for how people, young children, form opinions and ideas, right? And so we know that this is a place we have to start.
And I'm going to say that I'm like, because we have questions coming in now, if you are interested in partnering with universities and HR courses and places like that, email me afterwards, because I think we probably have about 150 members who either instruct at colleges and universities across Ontario or lead the departments. So it's like, that is something I would have liked to learn in my HR courses and wasn't brought up once.
Okay, well, we'll have to put a call out and say, all Moms at Work members who teach, let us know, because we would love to. We'll put together, even if it's a pre-record, and they could share, because it's a vital content for the curriculum. Thank you for that information.
Great. So we have a question from Diane. She's asking, how do you promote this to small businesses who don't have an HR person to set these programs up?
Yeah, that is a great question and a real challenge, because often when we work with larger companies on compliance outreach, they have sophisticated HR teams, they have HR departments. With smaller businesses, and by the way, the Act only applies 10 employees and up, so 10 and below, which is still a very small business. 10 to 100 is still a very small business. We have step-by-step guides. You can go to our website. There's an actual tool that would walk the employer through every single step, which we're in the process of actually creating a newer, easier to use tool. We also, our review officers see themselves as facilitating this process. While they're enforcement officers, they really do focus on and want to see, the company achieve the best results. So our staff will coach them and walk them through the process. We know there are a lot of pay equity consultants trying to flog services to do this work, which ends up costing companies a lot. So that's obviously an option, and a lot of the larger companies will do that. But for small businesses, we really do provide the content and the walkthrough document that will bring you through, like, what is job-to-job comparison? It's complex. Here's every single step you need to take. What's the proportional value method? How do you do it? Here's every single step you need to take. So these are thick documents that small businesses can work through and come to us with questions, and we don't penalize them when they ask us these questions. We really want to support them. Like, our goal is to support them. And what we found, I think this is an important stat to share. When I came in, I looked at some of the previous monitoring campaigns we did, and I noticed that depending on the sector, about 83 to 86% of companies that we worked with, if we found a contravention of the Act, they complied like right away, without an order, without any chutzpah. Like, they just were usually like shocked, like, oh my God, I had no idea. And they made the corrections. So, and some of these corrections, like they're not always massive, right? They're not always multi-million-dollar adjustments. Some of them are very tiny within the business. So we find that when we work with small businesses and uncover, they're keen to fix it, and they're keen to do the right thing.
We've got three more questions. Colette, you gonna?
Sure, yeah. Okay, so the next one is from Melissa Espinosa. She's asking, she's curious what the most common complaint your office gets and what is generally the outcome.
Well, the number one complaint you can make to the pay equity office is that you don't believe pay equity has been achieved or maintained within an organization. So when a company does a pay equity exercise, and they could have done it like 20 years ago, they have to maintain it. So they have to make sure that the wages are adjusted, and that over time, though, that adjustment doesn't spread, that the gap doesn't spread again. So the biggest complaints are, it's the same, it's pay equity hasn't been done, or pay equity hasn't been maintained. So the process, well, the outcome depends on the process. So we'll go in and we will do an investigation. We will look at, when or if the employer did a pay equity plan, and what the outcome was, and how they've maintained it, if at all. The process is a little bit different if the organization has a bargaining agent, because the bargaining agents have terms of reference or pay equity clauses in their collective agreement. So we have to.
So just for context, you mean unionized, so bargaining agents would be.
Yes, for a unionized and working environment. So a unionized place will have usually pay equity in the collective agreement or pay equity terms of reference. So we consider the whole picture and then we make a decision. So decisions are, decision or order. A decision is we say, nope, it's been maintained, pay equity exists, or an order will be calling it out and saying, no, it has not been achieved or it has not been maintained. And then we describe the next steps and the timeline to the employer.
Great. So we have actually people are very enthusiastic with the questions now. So the next one is there a way of seeing the status of pay equity of the company that you work for? This person works in Quebec. And how do you find that information?
So Quebec is different. So in Quebec, the way that they implement the Pay Equity Act is actually like with your taxes, companies have to file a pay equity report basically as part of like their annual review. So that is a great question. I don't know Quebec's business registry well enough to say, but I do know that if you contacted the Quebec Pay Equity Office, and I know Elena has sent you the link in the chat, you can find out more information because they have a very proactive approach of having companies annually file that report. We don't have that, that requirement in Ontario. So in Ontario, you couldn't.
Okay, great. So on to the next one. Linda Elwin is asking, childcare is a major factor on women in the labor market. What initiatives is your office, if it does, doing to help the government address this issue?
Well, it's interesting you say that because we also know that childcare and maternity leave and paternity leave have a huge impact on the gender wage gap. Like that's a fact. The reasons why doesn't necessarily mean to be true or accurate. Like there's no reason for women to be quote unquote penalized for going on to mat leave. What our office is doing is we're actually looking at research to bring that to the front to sort of say like it doesn't have to exist. This pay penalty doesn't need to exist. We're working with gender and the economy on some information. I mean, this is really not our direct mandate, but it's more included in our broader outreach because we understand that it is a factor affecting the wage gap. So, to our previous question, Allison, it's such a complex, even part of it is unexplained. For the parts we do know, which is we know mat leave and childcare is part of the gap, we work with partners to try to educate and elevate and put the research out there so policymakers whose mandate that does belong to, they can make the most informed decisions.
Great. So the next question is from Veronica Yeo. She's asking, when a company makes the adjustment, assuming if there's been like a complaint to your office, what is the retroactive time frame, if at all?
That's a good question. We generally go back to when the act was in force, so 1998. So yeah, so if we it's not always possible because sometimes it's a long time ago and it's before offices were digital, and say if there was a sale or a merger, an acquisition, not all that data is available. So we will work to find the most appropriate backdated time when the information is available. So it is retroactive to when the act came into force, but we work with companies and with employees to find the appropriate time to start our investigation.
Sure. Colette, let me cut this one down because it was, but here's someone who works in higher education. Who wants to talk about like regulation of contract workers, because this is becoming a bigger thing in terms of pay equity. So in higher education, she was mentioning that a lot of positions are filled by contract workers as, for this, and very few full-time positions to apply for. And that's overwhelmingly female. So that means this is a very unstable workforce. So what happens there with contracts, short-term workers?
Yeah, I know this is something more broadly that the Ministry of Labor is looking at because this is sort of a question about the future of work And we've seen, especially as like COVID's just brought, this pandemic has brought so much to life, the sort of precarious nature of this contract work. We, you know, and some of these contracts, the protection, and saying this and it's recorded, is unionization. You know, a lot of these part-time teachers, especially in academic environments, they are part of unions, right? And so then the unions would defend the rights of their contract part-time teachers. So I'm not endorsing unionization. I'm saying that this is just one of the sort of natural solutions that have evolved. Right. Policymakers, though, now are looking at it. And I would say that the policies that are in place are now being reviewed to account for this, because there hasn't been. This is a new phenomenon, but we understand it's the future of work. And it's important, you know, for our part, we make submissions. We'll be making submission to the Ministry of Labor. They have the Future of Work Recovery Committee. Yeah. The Ministry of Finance just announced Women in the Economy. We're going to be making submissions, and we're going to be talking exactly about this issue and say, this is like, we know that women make up a huge percentage of this sort of precarious part-time contract work, and there needs to be protections to be in place. So whoever asked that question, you're very, very timely. Check out the Ministry of Finance's task force on women in the economy and the Ministry of Labor's recent task force on workforce recovery, the Workforce Recovery Advisory Committee, because it's exactly what they're looking at.
Do they take submissions?
They do. Huh. So go to their website. I think timelines are fairly tight, but I'm sure, Allison, you've got lots of content.
We can make a submission. Okay, so we are actually like 1 minute over. We have two more quite what I think are simple questions. Do you have another 2 minutes just to answer these ones really quickly?
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. What is, so the legislation, so if you have a legislation in Ontario, so let's say we have other offices outside of Ontario, are only the employees located in Ontario covered under this legislation?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's important to know. Yeah. So the answer is yes, just the Ontario employees, and then other provinces would be subject, like in Quebec or whatever, to their legislations.
But we will, I'll just add to that very quickly. So if your company has multiple locations in Ontario, we'll look at the company entirely. We won't just look at a company who has a location in Toronto, but also Hamilton, Montreal, wherever, or so not Montreal, it's not Ontario. We will look at the entire company, not just the one location.
Okay. The last question is what is the process in protecting people from reprisal once a formal complaint is made? Is the person who put forth the complaint followed up with? Is there documentation to support or protect that person? How does that work?
So the person who filed the complaint generally at some point has to disclose their name to us, because we need to work with them, and we need like they have to provide information. They provide sort of a prima facie or like a basic case, right, for us to look at and say, you know what, you're right, there has been a contravention. We need to go deeper. Though we let the applicant know that you can act through an intermediary. So you could find somebody else who's willing to speak on your behalf and put their name forward as a way to protect. So we use that as another, you know, as a way to protect them. There's heavy fines for reprisals for companies. Like there's a very strong disincentive if they do this, and if they make, if somebody gets resigned, fired, or whatever, rationalized out shortly after a complaint to us is made, we're very active in doing a deep investigation to see if that was linked to, or how it could have been linked to their application. So we take it very seriously, and you know, the protections are, they remain anonymous to the employer, but at some point we need to know their name unless they work through an intermediary, which we give them that buffer, and then we take it seriously. We find the employers for doing this.
Yep. Great. Okay, so we have gone over.
It was so good. Thank you. Yeah. And if there's questions not answered, I'll talk to my team and we can type up answers and send them off to you.
Perfect. Okay, so we can send them over there. That would be great. So thank you once again for being here with us. And it's always a pleasure to have you on board, and for always listening to our community, which means so much to us in terms of people who are setting policy and legislation and really helping us understand as well. And so hopefully we can help you make some
Thank
content
you.
in colleges as well. I think this is such important work, especially for HR and managers to understand. So
it's so wonderful that you, Allison, number one, are doing the work that you're doing, and the community has come together. I mean, I'm a member, I follow. I didn't wear my sweatshirt today because it's so hot. Otherwise, I'd be wearing it. You know, it's so important that you're keeping this conversation going, because this is the space where, you know, policymakers they're listening, because they have no choice. It's as I said, it's an economic imperative now, and that's the moment we need to seize. And I'll use this to let your audience know that in the fall, we're launching a series called Level the Paying Field. And I hope we can share that series with your members, where we're
what is this? Level the Paying Field? I love this.
And we're going to talk about economics, equity, women, work, and money, which are all important things. So I think it's so amazing that you brought the community together and you're using your voice to elevate the equity conversation, which I think all of us are doing, and collectively it's getting louder. So thank you to everyone who's attending and who's sharing and who's keeping the conversation going.
Perfect. And we look forward to hear more about this fall initiative, because, you know, like, I'm all in.
Wonderful.
The Paying Field, all in. Great.
Excellent.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.